Right when I go and turn on my camera and I'm totally ready to record, my cat decides about 2 feet away that he needs to eat his food. The timing is just, you'd think it was intentional. In just a couple of months, I will officially have lived in Paris for 2 years. So that means that it's been almost a year since I made my very first video in French, which I'm realizing now that I'm looking at myself in the viewfinder, I'm wearing the same dress today as I was in that video. So that means that it has been almost a year since I officially started feeling like I was fluent in French. For those of you who may be new here, I am an American expat. I live in Paris, France, and now almost for 2 years, as I said, and I do speak French as well as Spanish. One question that I tend to get quite a bit is about being bilingual. It's about speaking French, speaking more than one language, and I realized I haven't actually just sat down and done a video on this topic, which you've already seen if you've read the title, but it's about being bilingual and some of the perks that come along with that. This can just as easily apply to being trilingual or multilingual, however many languages you may be able to speak or want to be able to speak, but I'm specifically going to talk about at least just speaking 2 languages because this is a huge goal for a lot of people. And I know a lot of people, a lot of you who follow me are very interested in being bilingual or are already bilingual or trilingual or however impressive you may be. I can't really remember a time before I started learning Spanish because I started learning pretty young, but it wasn't until I got older when I actually got more and more interested in learning not just as a second language to use sometimes or to be able to use in necessary situations, but to actually learn how to speak. Then when I was an adult, I started learning French, and that's even weirder because I now can't remember a time before I could understand French. I feel like learning a language has that effect on you because you sort of open yourself up to this entire other world, really. But I'm gonna stop myself before I start delving into that because I have categorized this, as usual. I have made a list, typical me, of a few of the perks that I personally have noticed since becoming bilingual. And I think basically what they all boil down to is how incredible this experience has been and how amazing it is to be able to speak another language. If you don't believe me now, hopefully by the end of the video you will. One of the biggest benefits of learning another language is maybe not one that you'd necessarily expect, but it's that it helps you have a deeper understanding of your own language. I remember taking Spanish in university, and there were several moments actually, not even just 1 or 2, but several moments when our teacher would introduce something to us, and the hardest aspect of understanding the concept was just being able to relate it to what it was in English. Take the perfect tense in English. So that is have lived. So I have lived in Paris for almost 2 years. Basically, it's an action that starts in the past and continues up until present day and could be continuing even further. It's a bit of a complicated concept if you don't have that in your native language, but Spanish does have it. It's used a bit differently. Obviously, French is a very similar one, but it is used completely differently actually in French. So it's a bit complicated, but the hardest thing for some of the students in the class when we were talking about this in Spanish and giving examples in Spanish was just understanding what it was in English and how we use it. Little bit of a disclaimer here, I am a huge grammar nerd. I have always been a grammar nerd. When everyone else in the class hated something, I would just be completely happy as a clam. So I did understand a lot of those things because that's kind of my specialty and a little bit of my passion, I'm gonna say. But your average person who may not be as enthusiastic about something as boring as grammar probably doesn't really know how this works in their own language, because when you just speak a language, you don't have to think about it. You don't have to think about how it functions. This is the exact same for anybody of any language. It makes it actually very challenging sometimes, like especially when my French wasn't as good, when I was speaking with French people, and when I would try and ask something that I didn't know, or when I would express myself in a strange way that maybe a non-native speaker would have understood, a native French speaker wouldn't understand it, or they wouldn't be able to help me if I was trying to ask them something. Even something as simple as asking what is the gender of something, if I don't phrase it in the right way, can actually throw off French people because they don't think about it. So when you start learning a different language, you have to be able to compare it back to your native language, and you have to be able to understand grammatical terms and basically how to relate it to the only language that you know if you're monolingual, or one of the 2 languages if you happen to be natively bilingual. It is so eye-opening, even for someone like me who was a total grammar nerd. I learned so many things when I was learning Spanish, when I was learning French. It's just completely shocking what you don't know about your own language. The second perk to speaking another language is that it gives you access to an entirely different culture in a way that translated materials and things just can't. Movies and series can be dubbed, they can be subtitled, books can be translated. You can get access to a ton of different materials from a ton of different native languages and still be able to absorb it in your native language. But you lose something. In some cases, you lose a lot. If you never tap into another language, if you always just absorb things in your native language, you never really know what you're missing. But the second you start being able to consume something in a different language, and then you start comparing to how it was translated, that's when it really becomes apparent. I've noticed so many times when watching English shows that are dubbed in French to practice my French, when watching French shows with English subtitles back when I needed them, or if I'm watching with someone who does need them, and you start being able to notice as you start being able to understand both, that sometimes the translations really just can't do it justice. There are phrases you can't translate, there are expressions you can't translate, there are just jokes and cultural references and language puns and things like that that just, they cannot be taken out of one language and put into another, or out of one culture and put into another. Translation is a beautiful art. Some people can do it absolutely incredibly. A good example of this are the Harry Potter books, which I have not yet read in French, but I have read about them. I've looked at some of the character name translations and just the ways that the French translators took those books and made them basically different, but like a different work of art. They really did an incredible job in a lot of ways, but it's not the same. And if you only consume the French and you never read the English, you're missing probably a lot of what is contained in the English. Same thing goes for any other translation from any language into any other language. You have to change stuff as a translator. And even in moments when you can't, or you choose not to change something, you often lose a lot of what the original meaning was. I'm now watching more and more French films, I'm reading French books, and I'm uncovering little pieces of culture and fun little things about the way people think, the way people use the language. The more I'm able to understand the language, the more I'm able to understand these different usages. There's just so many ways that people of all languages and cultures get creative with the way they communicate. And the more you're able to understand that in another language, the more amazing it really is. And you get to tap into an entirely different culture. The third benefit is that, of course, it can be practical when you travel. So there are a couple different ways that you can use a second language when you travel. The first one is traveling to a country that speaks that language. In this case, the language that you learn can be a super commonly spoken language like Mandarin or Spanish or French, or it can be something pretty obscure. But if you go to a country that speaks it, obviously it's going to be super practical. The second way you can utilize a second language traveling is just if you learn a language that is very commonly spoken. In this case, you can go to a country that speaks it, where you'll probably have lots of options if it's commonly spoken, or even if you go to a country that doesn't speak that language, you might be able to use it in very, very practical circumstances. For example, English, if you're not a native English speaker, tends to be a sort of universal international language. If your native language is Spanish and you visit Japan, for example, you might end up needing to speak English with people in order to communicate if you don't speak Japanese. There are also other circumstances that you may not even think of. For example, tours that might be given in different languages. If English is not available and you're a native English speaker, but you also speak Spanish, and there's a Spanish tour, you can take a Spanish tour. It can help you out in emergency situations, whether it's your emergency or somebody else's emergency. If it's a commonly spoken language, you're more likely to find someone who will be able to speak it with you. In general, the more options you have to communicate when you're going to different countries that speak different languages from you, the more ability you will have to get the most out of that trip, to experience more, and to really just not hold yourself back. The fourth perk is that it looks really good on a CV, and that goes whether the job requires that language or not. Especially as travel is becoming easier and more people are really seeing the value in travel, more and more employers are actually looking at being able to speak another language as a big perk. More and more jobs are also requiring or preferring that you do speak another language, again, even if it's not something you might use all the time. On top of that, most people know how hard it is to learn a language, so being able to say that you have an intermediate level or an advanced level or fluency in another language and being able to put that on your CV shows employers that you are skilled, that you have a skill that not everybody does, and that you took the next step from those high school classes that some people just go and sit through and pass the tests. You actually learned the language and you actually applied yourself. And being able to prove that to an employer can be very valuable. The fifth benefit is also just a bit of a fact, and that's that it exercises a ton of different skills all at once. Your social skills, your memory skills, your intuition, your improvisation. There are so many things that learning a language exercises all at once, from the time that you're learning just the basic letters and the super basic vocabulary to when you actually start trying to use it in conversation. We seriously have no idea as children, if we could just appreciate how complicated learning our native language must have been for our little baby brains. We have no idea how hard our brain must be working to absorb all this and to start seeing the world and understanding the world through a language and through that form of communication. It's really incredible. I know I'm geeking out a little bit now. I'm gonna try to pull myself back from the ledge, but it's just really incredible. When we get older though, and when we start trying to learn a second or a third or a fourth language, as an adult or even as an adolescent, once we've already started accessing the world in those 1 or 2 languages we may have learned growing up, it gets a lot more complicated, and you start actually realizing the work that your brain has to go through in order to learn an entirely different language. I know this is probably not sounding a whole lot like a benefit, but let me just wrap up sort of what I'm trying to get at with that. You're exercising. And just like when you exercise your body and you start seeing your body's more toned and more muscly and you feel healthier, when you exercise your mind in the same way with all these different aspects that languages really do exercise you? Can you say exercise you? You know what I mean. When you work out your brain like that, it improves the way that you function and the way that your brain can work in all the other aspects of your life as well. The last perk that I've written down, and I actually have written this down word for word, is that it's just a damn fun skill to brag about. Granted, this is not necessarily a big enough benefit to last you and motivate you through the years and the hardships of actually learning the language, but it is a nice little cherry on top. So those are just a few of the many, many, many benefits that I personally have noticed from being bilingual and that I have discussed with my friends who are bilingual and trilingual and multilingual, because there are a lot of people who are just way more impressive than me. Let me know in the comments any more that you would add to this list as well. And if you are learning another language and you're looking for some tips, some advice, especially if you're learning a language outside of a classroom or like something supplementary to a classroom, then I will link up here a video that I did, some tips, some advice about some of the ways that I have learned French. I have a ton of other videos on my channel about expat life, about learning French, learning Spanish, learning languages in general. So if that interests you, please feel free to subscribe and to like this video if you enjoyed it. As always, thank you for watching, and I will see you soon.